Am I talking loud enough for you? Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start with, go back a little bit. I had an inquiry, someone who said in the February 21st issue of U.S. News and World Report, there was an article about children's allowances. And the inquiry asked if that was true or representative, in my opinion. Well, I looked into that, and really was just, I think the word flabbergasted would be a word that described my response. Because in that article it talked about the median allowances in two different parts of the country. 50% of the teenagers between 12 and 18 had $50 a week median allowance in Ohio and Indiana. $50 a week. And $75 a week. It's strange. $75 a week in Ohio and Indiana, and it was $30 a week in Mississippi and Alabama. Those two numbers, to me, were kind of shocking. Now, median. Remember, the median is the midpoint. It means half of the numbers are below and half are above that amount. When you're talking about $75 a week, you're talking about $3,900 a month. I mean, $3,900 a year. And even $30 a week is over $1,500 a year. I find those numbers hard to believe. I find them hard to believe. Perhaps I don't want to believe them. But, $3,900 a year was actually more salary than I was making as the chief psychologist in 1949 in a mental institution. That sounds like very low wage, doesn't it? I'm also reminded that $75 a week allowance for somebody who went in the military and was receiving $21 a month. Yeah, food and allowances. But I knew a lot of guys that were making $21 a month in the Navy who sent half of it home to help the family. So I'm puzzled. What do kids spend $75 a week on as a median income? It must be that there's a lot of affluency out there that I'm not familiar with. I don't see that that would be particularly good for people to have that much money without a great deal of attention. Now here's another one. Get off of that one before I show my bias about poverty. The question was, when does parental responsibility cease? When does it come to an end? Well, one answer, a quick one, is I don't know that it does. No, we may not have financial responsibility for children after we get to be a certain age, or they get to be a certain age. But do we ever really lose that responsibility of trying to be a good influence, help the children do right? I'm reminded of a pattern about children, birth. All of us are now familiar with the unborn child. We know the unborn child doesn't breathe air. And something happens. As soon as the child is born and takes its first gulp of air, there's a little valve that closes. One closes so that the air is drawn in, goes to the lungs, which have not been used before that, and the blood circulates differently. See, the blood previous, as you know, was not going into the lungs to be reoxygenated. Excuse me, like happens with everybody after they're born, but it was being shunted, going through the heart, and the heart of the baby was pumping the blood out to the system. Okay, the point being, I think there's something like that happens to parents. You think about it. As soon as a child is born, maybe that's something equivalent to a valve closing or opening, and the parental responsibility starts, and it never really stops. Most parents continue to feel responsible for children, on and on and on. And some of them, of course, try to exercise that, and much to the dismay of some of the children. But I can certainly admit, even as a great-grandparent, of feeling some concern, preference, certainly, wanting children to do something or not to do something that I believe is right. Well, speaking of that, the next one comes up here. The question says, I'm a grandparent, but I don't know what I should do. Do you have any suggestions? Well, for first-time grandparents, well, be yourself. There's only one of you. And who are you? Well, you're who you are. You couldn't change your personality most of the time, even if you tried. The role of grandparents determined really by three major components. You know, your personality, what is it you feel that you want to do, should do, the personality of the grandchild or the grandchildren. How do they interact? What is their need? Do they have more than one? Major needs, of course. And then don't forget the parents. What are the parents expecting of you? Different kinds of grandparenting. Some grandparents, they're the controllers. They're involved all the time, and fortunately, because of necessity, sometimes children have been almost abandoned. The parents are broken up, the families, whatever happens to them. People are working out. And the grandparents are really the caretakers, sometimes full-time caretakers. And most of them do a pretty good job. That's one kind of grandparent. Another one is the kind that doesn't really want to be that involved, likes to be around when nice things happen, go to games, go to parties, show up at Christmas time, birthdays, things like that, to be involved that way. Another kind wants to be a reservoir. Come and ask me if you need help, if you need advice. Some other grandparents don't want to do anything. They just they didn't exist as grandparents, and they don't have any particular roles. They don't want any. They're happy doing whatever it is they're doing, which may be nothing. So take your choice. What kind of grandparent do you want to be? And let it work itself out. But why not talk it over? Talk it over with the children who are involved, the parents of the grandchildren. What do you expect? What do you not expect? And since parents typically come from different families, maybe the other side of the family, the in-laws, maybe they have quite different expectations. Maybe you were disappointed or very happy with your own grandparents, and you want to be like them or the opposite of what yours were. Work it out. It'll come out in the wash, okay? Here's another one. Kind of a sad situation. I run into this sort of thing, I think, too commonly. That my husband is objecting very strongly to my having our own son baptized. He says it's against his religion, and my religion says I should. What should I do? Well, first, what's the religion involved here? Where did you get married? Under what circumstances? With a sort of an open question like that, I make an assumption that, pretty safe assumption up here, that you're probably Catholic. Did you get married in a Catholic church? And if so, then we make another assumption that part of your agreement in terms of marriage was to rear your children in your religion. And your husband had to know about it. It used to be they had to sign a statement and make also an agreement to rear the children in the Catholic Church. But that requirement was dropped some time back. But the non-Catholic has to know about the promise that the Catholic makes. Now, if this is a circumstance, does a father have a right here? Say it's against his religion? Well, what religion? Did he have a right to object before the marriage? Of course. Did he have to agree? No. Did he have to marry you? No. What's going on? It gets to be serious. First, talk it over. Who's changing what? Do you have a right to continue with your promise that you made, and let's assume seriously? The answer would be, of course you do. Does the husband, the father, have a right to his religion? Yes. However, some agreements were made. So in a way, there's a violation of a contract. Also, talk it over, I would suggest. Talk it over with a priest who officiated at the wedding, the preparation for the marriage. He's probably very familiar with it. And sometimes these things can be worked out very easily. Sometimes not. I've known situations where someone honestly changed different belief system, adopted a new religion after the marriage, which may have been and is in contradiction to what promises were made at the time of the marriage. Do we say that people have a right to believe whatever they want to? If someone wants to believe, of course. What does it do to the other one? It's a serious situation. Those things are not easy sometimes, and they can be worked out. Excuse me. Most of the time, somebody's going to have to make a concession. There's going to have to be somebody's going to have to give in a little bit. I had rather not see what happens sometimes is that people say, well, our relationship is more important than any religion, and so they give up all religion altogether. That doesn't usually make anybody happy for a very long time. Many people change churches, but very few people change religions. Well, here's another one. So I don't like what my daughter is being taught in the 6th grade. What can I do about it? Well, first talk to your daughter. What's she really being taught? Try to find out what the facts are. Are you objecting to what's being taught because you don't agree with the facts? And if so, better check your own facts. Most teachers are conscientious. They want to do a good job, and they like to teach what the facts are. Or are you objecting on a moral basis, that a values stance, that you don't agree with the values that are being taught? So make it quite clear in your own mind what it is you're objecting to. Then if you still find it's unacceptable, in talking with your daughter, talk to the teacher. Find out the teacher's perspective on this. If you don't have satisfaction there and you're still unhappy, talk to the principal. Still not happy about it? Well, if it involves some very serious issues, maybe you could talk to the school board. You have several options. You can give in, wash your hands altogether, and say, well, that's out of my hands. The school does it. You can try to get your daughter excused from that particular class. Make up something else. Daughter could substitute some other kind of learning to make up for it. You could change schools. But try to keep in mind that whatever is going on is going to be important to your daughter. And she's the one that's caught up in this. That reminds me, gets right into the next question. It says, I've always allowed my children to watch cartoons in the afternoon and Saturday morning cartoons, but I've noticed lately, it seems to me there's some values being presented that I don't like. And the inquiry was, have you seen the values? Have you seen them? No, I don't really watch cartoons. It's been quite a while since I really sat and ever looked at one of these cartoon things. But if you find it objectionable, who's the parent? If you're the parent, there's something coming into your house you don't like. Not only do you have the right, but you have the responsibility to try to change what's coming into your own home. I think it is best if parents share with the children what they find objectionable. Just to say no or to turn the set off and say you can't watch that, sometimes that raises questions and raises anger in children. Whereas if you're a part of it and you explain it, explain what's going on that you don't like and why you don't like it, and explain whatever it is that you want to happen instead of what's being shown, the children are usually much more accepting of that. So give that a try. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Come up right away here. The first hit off the bat, so to speak. Question says, what's safe sex supposed to include? I'm not sure. No sex is the only safe sex in truly objective terms. But what's being dispensed these days as safe sex, of course, is sex with condoms. Some of you recall that that word wasn't even used in polite company not too long ago. Those things were not considered to be topics of discussion, and of course they're all over the place, handed out in schools. Everything in some schools. I don't know of any school around here that's handing them out, but maybe. But quite seriously, this safe sex is supposed to be sex that does not lend itself to sexually transmitted diseases. And if you get right down to 100% accuracy, the only safe sex is no sex. So there's always some chance of something. Here's another one. Said, when I was a little boy, I used to make up stories to tell myself and pretend what was going on wasn't happening in my family, or make up something else. I even had some imaginary friends. Sometimes even today, and I'm 40 years old, I get tempted to bring out my old friends. Am I nuts? Is there something wrong with me? No. Enjoy your friends. Bring them out. How about writing them down? Some of these stories you make up, you probably have your own favorite stories where you're the hero or something. At least most of the stories I've listened to, there are a lot of people who do this sort of thing. They make up stories where they are the champions of something, some cause that has better outcome than whatever they're living. But you know, some of the stories are rather interesting. And I suggest writing them down. Maybe they make good children's stories. Maybe they make good children's stories for your children or somebody else's. I think too many people become afraid that if they talk to themselves or have imaginary friends, that somebody else will think they're kind of crazy. Well, as long as you know the difference, it's okay. If our friends follow us around, sometimes they get in the way, these imaginary friends. You know, like Harvey and his rabbit. There's an old movie a long time ago. Well, here's another question. It says, when should I start teaching my children religion? You already have. You've been teaching it ever since a child started observing it, because you teach religion by the way you live, how you talk, how you dress, how you act. Keep on doing it. And as the child gets older, of course, add to it whatever your religion is. Explain what you do long time before you think the child can understand it. Children accept all sorts of things as long as the parent is willing to share. They don't have to understand everything. In time they will. It'll fall in place for them. You do a lot of things. You can't avoid teaching a child, so just go ahead and teach the child the way you think is best. You keep on with that, and maybe, what do you know, maybe the child will explain God to you one of these days. Children have very interesting impressions in religion, and they seem to go through stages. It's never too early to start by your own example. These formal explanations, well, try to make it on a child's level. But even if you know the child is not understanding, it's all right to go ahead and explain it. Maybe review it for yourself. Convince yourself what you're doing and why you're doing something. Okay? Here's another one. Says, the other day I took my mother to a doctor and he recommended she see a specialist in mental health. Well, we called our insurance company and we were asked, did we want to see a medical therapist or a talking therapist? The question is, what gives? Well, insurance companies are out to save some money. And medical therapists cost more than the talking therapist. And the difference is that the medical therapist can do both kinds. For example, a psychiatrist can certainly treat people with psychotherapy. They're well trained for that, but they also have the ability to treat people medically. Whereas the typical talking therapist is a psychologist or a social worker or a counselor, they do not and cannot dispense any medication. So, which one's the better one? I think everybody needs to be checked out pretty thoroughly. Maybe medical problems. Sometimes medical problems cause mental disturbances. And people need to be checked out to make sure that that's not part of what's going on. There is probably a safe way of saying start with a medical therapist, because medical therapists today, they're not at all opposed to recommending somebody go see a talking therapist. And maybe the person, your mother, needs both. Needs somebody to supervise medication and somebody to spend the time talking. Most psychiatrists today, in an area like we're living here in the North Country, there aren't enough psychiatrists, and so they don't spend a lot of time with the patient, typically. And so they're happy to have co-therapists. Here's a question, also relates to psychiatry. It says, my grandmother always seems to get depressed in the wintertime. Is that due to age or the climate or something? Well, there are people who do seem to get depressed in the winter. And what's been found, it's not the temperature that makes a difference, it's the sunshine. How much light is there? In the wintertime, we have relatively few bright days of long-lasting sunshine, just because the days aren't long. In summertime, we have much more sunshine. There are people who do have what's diagnosed as seasonally affective disorders and seasonally adjusted disorders. In other words, they tend to go down when it gets dark or have darker days. It would seem that these people should not live in very northern climates above the Arctic Circle, where it may be dark for 6 months, relatively speaking. Treatment for some of these people is bright sunlight and bright lights. Actually, there's therapies going on that expose people to very bright lights, and it seems to work. We're all quite aware of how well we feel if there's a bright spring day. Makes us all feel good. So it's not anything that's particularly unusual, and it's usually not a major depression. Here's a question that's kind of puzzling. I can only answer it in generalities, but it says, how do children learn to love? Well, children's capacity to love is awakened by the parents' love. When parents love, children learn to love. If parents hate, children learn to hate. There's a little old thing authored by someone called E. Nolte Law. Children are reared with love, they learn love, and it goes right on down through a lot of different conditions and circumstances. It's very popular. I've seen it on a lot of desks, lots of classrooms. And it's probably true. Whatever the environment is that children are reared in, that's basically what's going to be a major influence. Not the sole influence, but a major influence on how the child behaves. What children need is consistency. The parents need to be loving and value-laden, teach values. The school needs to be caring and not teach contradiction to parents' values. And the community needs to be caring and not contradictory to either the school or the parents. When you have those three things going, that's how children learn love best. Here's another question that gets off into some pretty deep ideas in a hurry. I'm always surprised how often this question comes up. It says, are there any really truths today? People who've usually been reared and experienced in the typical educational system find there are lots of gray matter out there, lots of different things that are gray, not just black and white. I think yes, the answer to the question, yes, there are truths. Two kinds of truths, basically. I simply call them capital T and small t truths. Small t truths are those scientific facts. We have gravity. We have certain things that occur. Scientific facts, and we know we can count on them. And these are absolute truths until more scientific discoveries are made. And yes, scientific discovery sometimes will turn things around. What we thought was an absolute fact turns out, well, maybe it didn't work quite the way we thought it did. It works another way. So small t truths are those things that scientifically we can count on, we can depend on. It's going to be that way. It happens a certain way. Until more scientific evidence is found. I think the capital T truths are those things that are indelible. They've been the truth since the beginning of humanity. That there are some things that are simply right, known to be right. They are common in all societies. Certain things that are right, some things that are wrong. There's a famous philosopher, Karol Wojtyła. Some people recognize the name, probably most don't. He put this together very nicely in a book called, or rather a letter called, Veritatis Splendor. And he talked about some indelible truths. I think our society is better if we accept the fact, and there's a fact as saying as if that's true. But if we do accept the fact that indeed everything isn't gray, there are some blacks and whites in this world, in this society. And it's important for us to learn what they are. Each person. What these may be. A truth for me, an indelible truth, may be a little different from the truth for you, that you may see it in a little different light, but fundamentally we're going to be in agreement about what a truth is, those capital T truths. Well, here's another one. We'll make it the last one for the day. Dr. Middleton, how do I get rid of the tension that I feel? Well, easy way is to look at it to try to avoid tense situations. I find, and if I'm really tensed up, the old thing that was taught to me in the Navy, that's quite a few years back, but I start off using that old exercise and lie flat on my back, relaxed. And you start with my hands or my feet, and on the count of 25, I'll either point my toes toward my head or my hands toward my head. Very slowly move them up that way. And then on the count of 50, when I get there, to let them go back. I never finish that exercise. I always go to sleep first. I did the same thing in the Navy. Almost failed the relaxation course. The Navy had one time a very special kind of thing that it was doing for those of us who were undergoing a particular kind of training. They came in with this fancy idea that we were supposed to learn to relax instantly whenever we had the opportunity. It was a great idea. And the class was held on either concrete or hardwood floors. Didn't matter. I remember they used to come around, the instructor would come around and wake me and tell me that I couldn't sleep a certain way, but it was always after the fact. I was sleeping when he would wake me. I said, but sir, I am asleep. I was asleep. Avoid the sleep deficits. That's a big thing today. A lot of people today just don't get enough sleep. They're pushing the clock. They're doing a lot of different things. Find out what you're really doing and why you're doing it. You may find that some things you do aren't necessary. They're not really getting you where you want to go. So back off a little bit. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. It's Family Life in the North Country. Yes, there will be. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Well, to start with, we're not going to be talking about family life right at the moment. The first question had to do with something that sometimes confuses people. The question was, what's the difference between a delusion and illusion, and hallucinations and visions? Well, delusion. Simple words to explain what a delusion is. False, unshakable belief. 3 magic words. If any one of the conditions, false, unshakable, or belief, is not present, it's not a delusion. It is a belief that in spite of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, a person will persist. It's unshakable. And it has to be false. The person who taught me that best was a patient of mine quite a few years ago. I always thought, well, I had the ability, I could be persuasive, I could convince anybody. Well, this person convinced me. She had a delusion. And, you know, this was another century, another time, another state. It was years ago. Fortunately, it was years ago. I was young at the time. New in the profession, this woman was a obstetrician, and she believed she was pregnant. Condition called pseudocyesis. And she knew more about pregnancy than I ever even thought I could ever learn. And she believed sincerely that she was pregnant. And in spite of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, she persisted in that and got into some interesting treatments. Then along the way, her psychiatrist, I was a psychotherapist, her psychiatrist gave her electric shock therapy. Immediately upon awakening and regaining consciousness, she said, "What'd you do with my baby?" From that point onward, it was past tense. She believed she had been pregnant. She was no longer pregnant. And, well, I continued working with her, and happy to say it had a good ending. She left the hospital. That was one of the state mental hospitals. She went back to working in medicine, but not the same field. She decided she'd change fields. Last I heard, she was doing well. Now, an illusion is a perception. We have all kinds of illusions. For example, you drive down the road and see a mirage. You drive down the road in the summertime and the heat waves on the pavement makes you see something that isn't really there. That's an illusion. It's a misinterpretation of a sensory perception. We all do that. And it's a natural thing for us. It's not a part of sickness. For example, if you were to say, "What's the shape of this table I'm sitting at?" You'd probably say, "Well, it looks square." But is it square the way you really see it? No. It's kind of a wedge shaped, isn't it? That's the way with any table. You don't have to look at this table. You can look at any table. Just look around the room where you are. We reinterpret what we see according to our own perceptions and our experiences. I could look at this table straight down and see that it's square, but at any other angle, unless I'm looking at it straight down from the bottom up, I wouldn't see it as square. That's an illusion. Hallucination is something else. Hallucination is a sensory perception without a demonstrable stimulus. Sound fancy? It is a sensory perception. It's one of our senses. You know, hearing, vision, taste, smell, body sensation, the feeling of touch. Kinesthetic, in other words, I know where my foot is without looking at it. That's another sense, kinesthetic sense. It's a perception in one of the senses, sense organs, but there's no stimulus. In other words, the stimulus is generated in the head, but we hear with our ears, see with our eyes, and so on, taste. We have that perception from one of the sensory organs. And usually that's associated with an intoxication, a drug intoxication, a toxicity. Or it may be brought on by a certain kind of mental illness. And there's a great deal of research going on right now trying to find out exactly how that occurs. And it's quite interesting. Now, a vision may indeed be an hallucination. For example, if I see something that's not there, and there is no sensory perception, physical perception, that is a vision, but it also may be hallucination. We have auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, sensory hallucinations, and so on. I've known a lot of people who've been hallucinators. I've known a lot of people who've had visions, and I even had two men one time when they were leaving the hospital. We'd finished a course of therapy, and they had both improved, and I thought I had done a remarkably good job. But on the exit interview, one of them turned to me and said, "You know, you really didn't help us." Which my ego fell to the floor. He said, "No, old Joe here and I got to talking one day after the group therapy session, and we found out I couldn't hear his voices and he couldn't hear mine. I was hearing voices and he was hearing voices, but we couldn't hear each other's. And so we got to working on that. We got to thinking about that." And he said, "And that's what really helped us." Okay, example of that. Sometimes people's hallucinations and delusions are very crippling to them. In other words, it interferes with their life. Other times, you wouldn't notice it, that people have them. And sometimes people have these experiences, particularly hallucination, and those around them, sometimes even the family, is not aware of it. Usually we can pick it up. We sort of know what to look for, those of us who've been around this for a long time. It's not particularly hard. But we all have the sensation sometimes, we have all had it, I should say, not that it's ongoing, but just before going to sleep, it's not uncommon. Somebody to have an experience and suddenly wake and be aware that one had a sensory experience, maybe hearing the name called or see something. It's called a hypnagogic hallucination, and that's not pathological either. It's in that twilight zone between sleep and waking. A lot of people experience that. It's not uncommon either for, and it's usually the women, because they usually outlive their husbands. For a woman who may have been married 50, 60 years, and to go to the breakfast table after the husband died and see him sitting at the breakfast table in his usual place, put it that way. Some of them have these experiences. I hear the husband's voice call her. It upsets them. Usually it's within about 6 weeks after the funeral, and it goes away. Doesn't happen anymore. The person had a mindset of what was going to be there, that the husband was going to be at a certain place. Sees the person, or hears the voice. That doesn't mean that somebody's lost it. It should be put in an institution of some kind. That doesn't require any treatment. Usually just talk to somebody about it who's familiar that these things do happen, particularly a long time. Well, here's another question that came in, a little bit different, but some of you recognize it. I had somebody drop me a note and said, "What is it? An Oedipus complex?" Now, Oedipus, it was spelled Ediface. And I looked at it and I thought, does a person mean Oedipus, Oedipus, and just misspelled it? Oedipus complex is that story about King Oedipus Rex, a man who fell in love with his mother, married his mother, actually had a daughter. That's a story in mythology. And that was where the Oedipus complex, the boys who have too close attachment to their mother, that's what Freud dreamed up and called it. But an Oedipus complex is quite different. I think I know some people right now who have an Oedipus complex. That means we build a monument to ourselves. We want our name on the face of a building. We build a monument, or we want one. Something for people to remember us by, an edifice, a face of a building. I think that's what the answer to the question was. If it was King Oedipus Rex, that story, It's when there's too close attachment to the mother. If you don't know that story, well, the riddle of the Sphinx. Sometimes we hear that expression, the riddle of the Sphinx. That was from the Oedipus story. Yeah, sometime I'll tell you about it. And here's another question. Says, what do you think about trying to teach when the students are smarter than the teachers? A lot of students think they're smarter than the teachers, and sometimes it's true. But two things come to mind. A wise person can learn from a fool, and a fool has trouble learning from anybody. So, why not? A student can certainly be more intelligent than a teacher. That's not a big problem. But what the teacher is teaching, the student may not know. It may not be a matter of intelligence, it may be a matter of knowledge. I've taught a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am. But it also reminds me of another one. I've used this for myself sometimes. There was a story that I read once about a PFC in the Army. He was a specialist in his particular field, and he'd just been drafted into the Army, and he was assigned to teach in the war college, where full colonels and generals go to school, admirals, people like that. And he was very concerned about it. With his PFC rating, he was going to be supposedly teaching these generals. So he opened his class in this way. Gentlemen, there are perhaps 1 million people in the world who know more about this subject than I do, but none of them are here. So we will continue with the class. And that's what goes on. Any person really who is really smart and intelligent is going to be learning from people who aren't as intelligent. That's not a problem. People who are really intelligent, that's not a problem. Somebody who is threatened by that, yeah, they have a problem. Here's a question. How old does a person have to be to quit learning? It never happens. You know, as long as there's one cell clicking, and a one-cell animal can be taught tricks. I guess if there's one cell in the brain that's working, we can still keep on learning. And we're going to be learning regardless. A lot of people have had that mistaken idea that age stops learning. And it's been documented very well in recent years that there is no such thing as stopping learning until the person's dead. As long as the brain cells are functioning, and they function as long as there's life, there can be learning. There's a lot of differences here between a person who wants to learn and somebody who's accused, for example, as I've been accused of being closed-minded. Motivation, incentive to learn may change. Old people sometimes, for example, I've studied a lot of different things, and somebody comes up and wants me to learn a different perspective on something. Well, do I have the time? Do I want to put the energy in to learn that? Or is what I've learned in the past, been there, done that type of thing, is that good enough? I may not want to learn something new simply because of a time element or my laziness. That's always a factor, isn't it? I may not want to put the energy into it. Well, let's see here. We have another one here. Well, that one is much too complicated. I think what we better do then is call it a day. We'll call it a day, whatever the time of day is to you. This is Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. And have a good one.